Hello and welcome to On Again, Off Again.
Yeah.
On again.
We are on again. Love being on again.
You and I kind of remain on.
Yeah, that's right. We're
which
never
is the
off.
goal.
Yeah, that is good. It is better to be on all the time than on again, off again, like some of these couples we talk about.
See, couple-wise, that might be a good thing, but I don't know if you should always be on.
Yeah, I don't know. Some people should rest every now and then.
Yeah, no.
Get some sleep.
Although you and I certainly have these conversations all the time.
That's true, yes.
That's always on.
Yeah, these conversations that you're hearing for on again, off again are but a small fraction of the conversations that we have about this very subject, or these subjects, I guess you could say.
Yeah, this podcast literally started because we were having one of these conversations, and I said, maybe we should record this.
Yeah, and people have said they'd love to be a fly on the wall in some of these conversations.
Is true. Yes.
Now, on that note, who are we talking about today?
Han and Leia.
Han and Leia? Is it Han or Han? That's the
I'm
thing.
going to say it Han just
Han.
as much as they do.
Yeah.
They go back and forth through the whole thing.
Which I think is exactly half the time they say Han versus Han, you know.
I'm just going to troll everybody a little bit.
In the original trilogy, anyway. In the sequels, they'd say Han pretty consistently, but...
See, that is one of those things I feel like I have to kind of jab at people a little because I don't know those movies well enough to have even thought about this. And then for some reason went back and watched like Empire Strikes Back or a clip of it or something, and immediately they say Han. And I was like,
yeah.
Of all of the things that you could nitpick about in Star Wars, we're not going to talk about that one ever? I thought it was weird that I'm personally had to notice that in order to know it was a thing.
Yeah.
No one ever talks about it, and I thought it was weird. I was like, that's pretty, egregious and weird.
Yeah. And then the other thing that's egregious and weird, frankly, is their relationship. Han and Leia.
That's right. That is true. And that's kind of why we wanted to go through what they're doing.
Yeah, to be fair,
today.
to be clear, I mean, we are rooting for them in a way, but at the same time, their relationship is interesting. Yeah. It's,
Well, and maybe it is just interesting. Maybe it is, I don't know.
Not meant to be a model of a healthy relationship. It's meant to be an interesting part of the story.
Well, and it is weird because it's one of those where I'm not sure that I do root for them as much as the movie says that we should because they're the romantic drive, and you put an incredible score behind any scene and you're going to feel the feels. So,
true, yeah.
I don't know. But
well, to be fair, though, better that she got together with Han than with the other guy in her life. We don't need Star Wars to become Game of Thrones. Although Dune is pretty close to a Star Wars Game of Thrones sometimes.
Just the good halfway point.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and it is. I think that, look, it's interesting enough that we're going to talk about it today because it's certainly noticeable, and I think a lot of people look at it and go, what is this something we should root for? And that's the big part of what we like to talk about in On Again, Off Again is, could they have worked? Should they have worked? And maybe, what would they need to do to fix it? What kinds of things are going to be different here? So let's go ahead and pick them apart. I'm going to be relying on Nico a whole lot in this conversation because I'm not as big of a Star Wars fan. As I say, I can speak the language.
Yeah. I was a little surprised by some of the fans when they were watching the sequel movies and, they found out that Han and Leia didn't work out. Like, what? I can't believe you would destroy this beautiful couple. I'm like, no, I watched that and I said, that makes total sense that they're divorced now or otherwise not together. Of course they didn't last. But that's not the point. The point wasn't to build, strong, healthy relationships. Star Wars has never really shown us much in the way of strong, healthy romantic relationships. It shows us interesting ones that drive the tragic story forward.
And it is interesting because if you were to have only seen the sequels, you could almost say that the reason they're not together is that sort of shared tragedy, not being able to come back from what happened to their son.
Yeah. Because it's hard to come back from a crisis where a son dies or something like that. I can imagine a whole lot worse when a son runs off and joins the First Order and sells his soul to the dark side. Jeez.
There certainly are people who have to deal with being the parents of serial killers, and that's the
or gang members or anything like that. Yeah,
murderers in general. There have been many people who have to confront what happened there, and when you're confronting that with your partner, oftentimes people don't always come back from that. They can be difficult. So something that you can see in the sequels is there's a possibility of precisely that. Okay, now I'm going to say something interesting here, which we can come back to in a little bit, that ironically for Luke and Leia, I'm going to probably do that a lot.
Oh boy.
For Han and Leia.
Yes, for Han and Leia, not Luke and Leia.
Han and Leia, shared crisis is their driving point.
It is the basis of their relationship.
So while it almost makes more sense, like in a grander psychological sense, that this couple would have not been able to stay together in the midst of that tragedy, that ironically, maybe Han and Leia could have.
Yeah. Because that's the whole thing. Their whole relationship is based around crisis. It's how they get together. Really, I mean, they find each other during a time of crisis when she's a prisoner on board the Death Star, and they can't stand each other from the get-go. I would say that there's very little hint that maybe there might be something going on with them eventually in that first movie, beyond a sort of brief conversation between Han and Luke where Han says that Leia has spirit and then has that line, "Do you think a princess and a guy like me?" And Luke immediately shoots him down. "No." And Han gets this big grin like, "Oh, okay, so you're interested in her. Fine." And it seems if you had to guess where that was going from there, you'd think, okay, Han's going to leave it alone because it's going to be more Luke's situation. But then we get to Empire Strikes Back. There's clearly some piece of the history between what happens in A New Hope and what happens in Empire Strikes Back that we're missing, that we haven't seen. Han makes reference to a bounty hunter on a certain planet that made him nervous, basically, and now he knows, no, really, I have to pay back Jabba the Hutt. I'm guessing Hoth was not their first choice of places to hide, because who in the world would choose Hoth first?
Yeah, seriously. No, well, and probably because it is defensible.
And so hard to find. It's clear they've been there a while. And so there's this history between them. And then at the beginning, he's talking about how he's going to leave. And they have a brief interlude there and turns into an argument. And then he's leaving. And the only reason that he stays, first, is because then Luke goes missing. So he goes to find Luke.
Right.
And then because the Empire attacks and he decides, no, someone needs to get the princess out of here. I think that would have been the last we saw of the two of them if it hadn't been for the Empire attack.
Right.
Because he would have gone off to pay Jabba the Hutt and goodbye.
And it is. These outside forces continue to push them into a place where they are in close enough proximity to one another to have to question whether or not they have a relationship. And that's not the greatest situation, honestly. I mean, for one, that's like the end of Speed. That's the whole quote of, they say that relationships built in times of crisis rarely work, or whatever it is. Like,
relationships based on crisis or shared trauma rarely work. And what does Sandra Bullock say? Oh, we'll just have to base it off of sex then.
Yeah, well, and
wow, okay.
It's like you said that like maybe they would have based it on sex, but this is supposed to be a family movie.
Yeah,
like,
maybe Han and Leia would have, but yeah, family movie.
Yeah, so they get
gotta tone it down.
So they do have to keep it relied on this shared crisis situation, which is strange and fairly contrived.
And yet at the same time, I think it probably is a little believable in one particular way. Not believable that it would last, but believable that it would happen. Because when you've got people who are at war all the time, they're in a constant state of crisis. And someone who does well with you at a time of crisis is actually a good thing to have around. And the thing is, Han is at his best when it's a time of crisis. He's about to leave all selfishly and doesn't care about the rebellion. Here's Luke's in trouble and immediately saddles up to go and save him. He's even told that he's going to die, and he says, "Then I'll see you in hell," which apparently they believe in hell in this setting, even though it's never mentioned anywhere else. But
Force hell.
Force hell, yes, that's where the dark side goes. But yeah, he rides out to find Luke facing what seems to be certain death, and manages to bring him back. And then again, about to leave, like I said, Empire attacks. He steps up to save her, and leading all the way up to when he's frozen in carbonite. That happens in part. He doesn't fight till his last dying breath, so to speak, in part because she's there and it would endanger her. He is at his best in these times of crisis. And because Han and Leia are constantly in states of crisis, Leia gets to see his best more often.
I think that's okay in the sense of, like, maybe highlighting some of the things worth being attracted to.
Yeah.
That you would see somebody that, because they did this thing in this situation that is new, you saw a new perspective. You saw something in them that, you you end up reacting to that is seeing them in a different light, that certainly can cause an attraction and allow you to be able to grow from that place. Yeah. That's fair. And I think you could reasonably say that that's what happened in their situation. The other side of that, though, is that just because you've seen somebody do something attractive to you for a moment doesn't mean that attraction does not equate to a good relationship.
No, it doesn't. And
2, when you are seeing that person do something, say the thing that you are attracted to is them being really good at something, being a good person, being valiant, being, they're like, especially in a wartime situation, you're probably seeing a lot of traits that are honorable and good, and that you probably think like, ooh, I should want that. I do want that. And it's should want, do want, sometimes go hand in hand. And I think that what that might eventually amount to, I don't know, is something where you look at a good person that is not necessarily good for you.
Yeah.
I think that happens a lot. There are two sides two ways to look at that, I think. One, if somebody has been with a person for a good long period of time, and this person is likable, a good person, and they're thinking, well, why shouldn't I stay with this person? Look at all these traits that they have. Look at all of these things that I like about them. It's not like Han, if you were to look at him in a sense of he's roguish, he's handsome, he's a good pilot, he is loyal, he works hard, like, might be a bit of a scoundrel, but kind of on the surface. He's
selfless when push comes to shove.
Exactly. Like, his best traits come out when it matters.
Yeah.
And I think that even, that's kind of like the girl having to, like, convince dad of the bad boy, but dad wouldn't, like, he has this and this and this. And it's not obvious. It's not always seen. But.
Yeah. And he doesn't get along with her father.
Yeah. Yeah, she's not precisely being like defending him to Vader, but
had Bail Organa still been alive, the man who raised her, that could have been a very interesting conversation to see.
That kind of thing where I think even in our own minds, when we do that same sort of justification of the person that we're with, when you're not sure, or if your family's not sure or whatever, there are situations where you might start going through their traits and saying, but this. And it's that pro side, it's the pro column, and whether or not you're making a cons list, sometimes that's all that you're doing is you're listing the good traits and the things that are worth looking into for this person. That's fine, but I don't think that people need to get trapped in a relationship with somebody just because they're a good person.
Yeah.
There are other things to measure. Do you have the same goals? How do you speak to each other? Han is a good person, but he and Leia don't talk to each other like they're good people.
Yeah. See, the thing is, in Empire Strikes Back, we get that moment where he's about to leave, and we get that exchange where he looks at her and he, very solemnly says, "Well, Your Highness, I guess this is it." And she says, "Yeah, this is it," kind of seeming sad about it. It's like, wow, that's a very civil exchange. But then he starts acting like a teenager. "Well, don't get all mushy on me. So long, princess." And he storms out, and then she goes chasing after him, and they have name calling, and I mean, she ends up calling him Laser Brain, and scruffy looking nerf herder doesn't come until later, but a lot of name calling, and he'll say, "Your worshipfulness," like it's an insult, and I don't think anyone else in the whole series calls her Your Worshipfulness or calls anyone Your Worshipfulness.
Yeah, what a title.
You get Your Highness, you get Your Majesty and stuff like that, or Master or whatever. Your Worshipfulness is him insulting her right back. Probably not as cruel of words as nerf herder, but whatever a nerf herder is. Someone who herds nerfs.
Right, yeah. Like, ooh. Yeah, that's what we're meant to do with that insult.
Pig farmer or something. I don't know.
But see, I think that is precisely the other side of what's going on here when you think about the close proximity problem.
Yeah.
When else do you have that? In school.
Yep.
When the pool
is small.
There's not a lot of people.
And you are forced to be around these people on a regular basis.
Yes, and you do. You end up dating each other. And these people that you have probably known from elementary into high school.
Just thought of another analogy. Prison.
Well,
sorry, but
that's a different conversation.
Yeah, but learn to get along with the person you're with, even if they're terrible to you.
Well, yes,
I mean,
right,
and then probably the army and things like that too. Again, this is a war film in its own way.
You do have to learn how to interact with each other when you're in situations like that. I guess I was speaking of it more like in the sense of romantic prospects.
Yes, yeah.
But if there is something where you are, say, in a school situation where you continue to have these moments and opportunities to see something attractive in a person, that's a different kind of thing. But it's like you can't date in high school the way that you dated on the playground in elementary school.
Yeah, and you can't date in the adult world like you dated in high school. Yeah,
seriously,
it needs to be more than that. And in some ways, I feel like I can give Leia a little bit of a pass because at least by the time of A New Hope, Carrie Fisher was 19, and Leia is clearly meant to be, in her late teens, early 20s. I mean, her twin brother is also a teenager into his early 20s over the course of the films. But Han is 33. Well, Harrison Ford was 33 at the time that they filmed the first one. So he's in his 30s chasing after this 19-year-old, and he's upset that she's immature. You jerk. Of course she's a little immature. If she's immature, that's maybe why you don't pursue her, But he's sort of demanding of her a reason why he should stick around, what about you need? And it's like, Han, a better way to do this might be to say, look, here's the thing, princess. I want to be with you. I don't care about your rebellion. I don't care about the reward. I don't even care about the glory. If I was going to stay, you'd be the only reason. Is that something you want? That would have been the mature thing to do.
That'd be a lot more romantic, too. You know, you're the only reason I would stay. What do you think?
Yeah. Instead, he's all, come on, and points at his own face, and then points at her, based on the slightest cues of body language, I guess. It's clearly more about his ego than it is even about his interest. We were watching episodes of Cheers, some of the ones with Frasier when he was young, just because we're big Frasier fans. It's interesting to see where the character came from. And Sam and Diane are an atrocious couple. We need to do an episode on them someday about all the red flags. I mean, they have more red flags than communist China. But a big one comes in the episode when we first see Frasier because Diane is dating him, but Sam is convinced that Diane still has feelings for him, and it's pretty clear that it's not because Sam is interested in Diane, because he makes it pretty clear that he hates her. And frankly, I think he is sincere about that, at that point in the story anyway. But nonetheless, he needs her to still have feelings for him because it feeds his ego. And in like the next episode, when another woman comes along and Sam hits on her and she refuses him, he does everything in the world going crazy to get this woman to like him. And I think it's to some degree the same thing with Han in this case with Leia, that for the sake of his ego, he desperately needs her to admit that she likes him because he's picked up on it. But rather than, doing, again, the mature thing and saying, Leia, I want to be with you. Or, I get that he doesn't want to say the words I love you, although he does say them in Return of the Jedi in kind of in a crisis moment. She's just been shot. And he says it with a big smile, like it's kind of partially a joke. But even so, it is more about his own pride, and that's why he can't be the first one to say it.
See, that's a point where it's worth pointing out, though. A lot of people and a lot of criticism has come for that I love you, I know.
Yeah.
Because that moment seems like ego. It's like, you jerk,
Yeah, you're not going to say I love you too, but it really is, because their whole relationship through that whole movie is him trying to get her to speak her true feelings. And she keeps holding it back and covering it up. And, there's a certain point where when she's saying I love you, it's not just because she's overcome with that emotion in that moment. It's because she's realizing, I might never see him again. I hope he knows this. And so him saying I know isn't just his ego in that instance. It is him telling her, yes, I know.
Yeah, he has been wanting her to admit it.
Yeah.
And when she finally does, he's giving that sort of, it's okay.
Yeah.
Like, yeah, I do know that.
I love that they repeat that in Rise of Skywalker for all its flaws, with Ben Solo having just come back from the dark side, getting all teary-eyed, talking to the ghost or memory of his father. It's never entirely clear which one it is. And that whole, Dad? He doesn't even get to finish it before Han says, I know.
Yeah.
He wanted his father to know that he loved him, even after the terrible things he'd done.
And you do. You just get that,
yeah,
honey, I know.
Yeah.
And that's, it does need to be said, but knowing that it's already understood is powerful.
Yeah.
Now that's, again, this is a relationship podcast, so we might as well go here.
Yeah.
There is a balance between the kinds of things that need to be explicitly stated and the things that can be implicitly known. Because sometimes it's both, depending on a situation. I love you is one of those things where it's like, yes, you do need to say it often and at the right moments and when you mean it and in the right way, and make sure that it's heard and known and understood.
Yes.
But if for some reason something should happen and you don't get to say it one last time, say in that kind of situation, as long as you know that you knew it, there doesn't have to be any grief for that in particular. And yet a lot of people carry that kind of thing because, granted, there are some situations where it's, did they know?
Yeah.
And that's where you have to balance these things. Make sure that your partner knows how you feel about them.
Yes.
That should not be something that a person is second guessing. Because, look, in a marriage, why on earth would you allow your partner to not know how you care about them?
Yeah.
That's... Please seek counseling if you
Yes.
feel you are in that situation.
Yeah.
However,
Absolutely.
I think this advice can go out to those dating a little bit more, because there's this problem of the not putting labels on it and not knowing,
Yeah.
are like, I like you, or those kinds of, like, not even quite that silly.
Yeah.
But there are situations where we don't always know how the other person feels. And frankly, this is, it's such a cinematic thing to represent people as playing the game of trying to figure out how someone else feels, when literally the kindest, most romantic, sexiest thing that you can do is be open, honest, and vulnerable.
Open, honest, and vulnerable. Yep.
Oh my gosh. Like, if you're not willing to do that with this person, ask yourself why. And if the reason is because of something in their character or something that you don't feel like you can be open, honest, and vulnerable with them, why are you with them?
Yeah. And if the problem is with your own inability to be open, honest, and vulnerable, then seek counseling or therapy about it.
Right.
Work on it. Because
True.
it might be that it's actually them, and maybe they just don't have the right tools to bridge your gaps, so to speak. But it might be that nobody with any kind of tools is going to bridge your gaps, and you need to work on it yourself.
I think Han and Leia remain a good, what's the word? Banner in each of these things where you can lay that up to say, like, they had an opportunity to look at one another as, you're just looking at the pro list, not the con list. And when you've got the pro list up there and there are enough reasons to be with someone, like, there are so many things, you have just enough on the positive side to tip the scales. That doesn't necessarily equate to longevity.
Yeah.
And the kinds of things that do equate to longevity are those things of how you speak to one another.
Yes.
What you pull
huge.
out in one another.
Yeah, don't call each other laser brain.
The scruffy looking nerf herder.
Yeah. Or give compliments or complimentary terms of endearment, but sarcastically. Oof.
Right. Yes.
That's big. That is a red flag.
Yes, that's very biting, and it's meant to be biting, and it's that's the other part of it, is like, sometimes people say things to their partners that hurt their feelings unintentionally. And then there are people who say things to their partners to hurt their feelings intentionally.
Yeah.
And that is a dangerous, slippery slope. Because, look, some of us have just not learned how to appropriately joke.
Yeah.
And there might be something that your buddy could take that your partner cannot.
Yes.
And if you are a sarcastic person, or if you do tend to joke around a bit, just, be somewhat facetious, those kinds of things, you need to make sure that you have the openness, honesty, and vulnerability with your partner to turn it off. Like I said at the beginning, you can't always be on.
Oh, yeah.
Right?
Can't have everything on all at once.
That you have to be able to turn down the faucet a little bit and let that flow. You don't need to turn yourself off. in order to accommodate another person, but you do need to be willing to read a situation, and you need to be willing to work with somebody in a way that's going to be effective. And I think that's something that Han is maybe not great at, that that in these moments when I don't think anybody should be required to read a moment and not be able to have someone come back later and say, look, you didn't know what was going on, but what you said there was it was hard to hear because of where I was. This what's going on. You can have that moment of conversation. Like, I know you didn't mean it this way, but it came at me this way because of such and such that I need to tell you about. They have that moment, but it is something where there are other situations where it's like, Han, just put it away. Like, that's Empire Strikes Back versus Return of the Jedi.
Yeah.
That's where you see his growth in that, because in Empire, he is so combative, and these moments when you could have chosen tenderness, when
although their body language is very tender. He's the scene where he's stroking her hand very gently, for the total lack of tenderness in terms of things they say to each other and such. At the same time, when they're in close proximity and alone, there is a physical tenderness between them, and that contradiction just frustrates the heck out of them, and all the more makes him want to make her admit that this isn't nothing. It's like, are you leading me on, sweetheart, or is this something real?
That is a little bit more that schoolyard thing.
Yeah.
You say one thing, you do another.
Yeah.
There's an immaturity in that, and where it's, those are some of those moments where I think you can give him some excusability in that because of his frustration. She is clearly not, I was about to say she's not being vulnerable with him, but she has, at this point, has no, she doesn't need to be.
Yeah.
Like, that's not,
He
like,
hasn't given
dude.
her a reason to be vulnerable with him. You know?
Like he's given her a lot of reasons to put up walls.
Yeah. I mean, the first time they met, when they finally get out of the trash compactor, and she's complaining and like, will someone get this walking carpet out of my way, referring to Chewie, which she dissed Chewie. Girl, you do not diss Chewie. Big 7-foot teddy bear, and you insulted him, girl. But even so, he says no reward is worth this.
Yeah. You diss my best friend.
Yeah.
Like, you're not as special as you think you are.
You're not grateful for the fact that we risked our lives to come and save yours. Yeah. She's a bit of a brat in the first one. She gets better, but even then, she and I say this loving these characters. I want to be clear that I love these characters, but they would be so frustrating to know in real life. Every single character in Star Wars would be so frustrating to know in real life, all for their own individual reasons. I suppose Luke at the end of Return of the Jedi would be awesome to hang out with. But whiny Luke, I want to get some power converters, from the first one, would be kind of insufferable. But, makes them memorable, makes them interesting. And we see a little bit of ourselves in them.
And you do see the growth opportunities in those moments. And there is. I think that this goes back a little bit to what I was saying of just knowing where you are with people and being honest about what kind of situation you're in. Because I think that if Leia were pushing back a little bit, it would be like, dude, why are you coming after me so hard? Like, what are you doing? What are you doing? That's a valid question. What are you doing? Why are you? What even is this? There's a lot that we don't see, so we can't really pick that apart of what it is that really makes them even have this sexual tension.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I think if we're going to allow some of these conversations to be applicable to people in the real world, that sort of thing where it's like if someone is being weirdly like somewhat flirtatious but like in an aggressive way or something, I think you have every right to be like, what are you doing? What are you doing? If are you trying to pick me up because I don't vibe with this? I don't want that. Are you trying to be a jerk because that's totally how you're coming off right now and I don't want it? Are you like especially as women, and this does apply to men, but especially as women, you do not need to play into this go be a little bit of a jerk to her. Like that's this thing where I think sometimes one, it's the line of if he's cute enough he can get away with it, because if you're not attracted to him at all, you're going to see just the jerk. If you're physically attracted to him even a little bit, you're going to think like, well, maybe there's something, like you're going to make all that pro list justification. But there is something where I think that's where you need to, and this is where this encompasses both men and women. If you know what you want, like, I want a partner that treats me this way, X,
and
Y,
Leia
and Z.
says she happens to like nice men.
Thank you. Yes. So presumably she knows.
Other than Luke, we don't see her pursue any, but
yeah, right. Well, seriously, and maybe this is a little bit her kind of like kissing Luke. Maybe she does stand up for herself a little bit in that moment in a weird way. But,
very weird considering, but she didn't know that.
She didn't know. And what that is when a guy is being aggressive in a bar, turning to the guy sitting on the seat and just kissing him. Like, screw you, dude. I would take anyone over you.
Yeah. And I mean, in the case of at the bar, to be like, no, I'm already with somebody. Thank you. And I think that was kind of what she was implying there. Like, I'm more interested in Luke than in you, to get Han to drop it.
Right.
And, Luke in the meantime just, okay, I'm feeling good about this.
And I do. I think that's something where, like, you have that opportunity early on to call someone out on their behavior, even if that behavior is not necessarily aggressive, but maybe, like, he is trying to call her out on her behavior.
Yeah.
And there are some things where I think, like, I think with human beings, we need to be realistic and willing with each other to not let subtext breed toxicity.
Yeah.
Where, like, maybe this is something more. And it's like, okay, but you're not talking to each other. You're being combative. You're calling each other names. You're bringing out the worst in each other. You're just goading each other on. You're acting different from your body language. This contradictory, stuck, dualistic nonsense is not worth supporting for the, pulling petals off daisies. and saying, he likes me, he doesn't. The
Suddenly I'm imagining Han, just very silently plucking petals off a flower. He's thinking it, he's not saying it. And meanwhile, Chewie in the background just sort of watching him, just knowing.
Chewie just rolling his eyes. You do like the image of Alfalfa sitting there with you have like R2D2 and C3PO sitting up in the tree house, just rolling their eyes at him as he's writing love poetry to Darla Leia.
Darleia.
That one.
Yes. That. Now, they do grow a bit by the time of Return of the Jedi. There isn't much that we really see in the interactions between them, but there is something. She saves him from Jabba's palace. She's the one who goes in that awesome bounty hunter disguise
best
and everything.
Outfit in the series.
Yeah, that was pretty cool. And
from my female perspective.
See, I know that a lot of guys would say the best outfit in the series is the gold bikini, but I actually liked what she wore when she was with the Ewoks. That was a very
That's a
nice
cool
dress, and they did a
outfit.
great thing with her hair.
I actually was it the
yeah.
Cloud City one that I was like, why does no one ever do that outfit?
Yeah, the Cloud City one is pretty cool.
That one was cool too.
She's got the buns, but they're a little different.
They're like the hanging loops.
Yeah.
It's like Katara's loops.
Yeah, that was pretty cool. And the
hair
camouflage
loopies.
poncho on Endor is kind of cool, but that's a little more, functional rather than fashionable like some of our other stuff. But yeah. But anyway, yeah, so she saves him, and they have the whole thing, where he asks who it is, someone who loves you, Leia. That's kind of cute, But then we have that moment. It's kind of interesting the way it goes and then turns around again, where she talks with Luke, and Luke reveals first of all who his father is, and then who his sister is, and Leia says, somehow I've always known. And it's like, well, then what? Yeah.
Awkward.
That throws the kissing thing into
That
question. We said
made-
she didn't know, and I still think she didn't know, but that line makes it weird.
Yeah, that made things weirder.
Yeah. But then he, she puts it
kiss
together.
him. He's like my brother.
Yeah. But then she puts it together that, he has to go and face Vader, which is also her father, and it's an emotionally devastating moment. He leaves. Han comes out.
Dropping it on her, yeah.
Yeah. He leaves to go do his thing. Han shows up and wants to talk with her. Clearly you can see that something's bothering her. And that's the thing, is that's Han showing an interest in her well-being and her feelings beyond simply, I'll save your life. It gets into, okay, she's upset. I better be the supportive boyfriend, or whatever the term is in a galaxy far, far away. But then she keeps rejecting it, and after a couple of tries, he gets very defensive. Could you tell Luke? Is that who you could tell? And when she starts to cry, at first he's storming off, then he stops, and he turns around, and he says, I'm sorry. And then she goes and she hugs him. And she doesn't tell him about what's going on.
See, okay.
But
she doesn't need to tell him what's going on in that moment. What she
Yeah.
does need to tell him, Luke is not in the picture when it comes to the romantic side of my life. Like, he is not a rival of yours.
Yeah.
Can we put that nonsense away?
yeah, and she didn't necessarily need to tell him that in that moment while they were hugging necessarily, because she's pretty overwhelmed with the shockingly bad news of, hey, you're related to Vader, and Luke's going to go off and probably die facing him.
Yeah, you just learned that your dad's
jeez.
alive and now he's gonna die and he's a horrible person.
Yeah, there's a lot in there, but nonetheless, there should have been at some point around there a conversation of, no, you don't have to worry about Luke and me.
I guess that's why I say it, because it's not, frankly, it doesn't even have to have taken that long, because it's
Yeah.
not dependent upon their sibling relationship. She doesn't have to even explain that as being a factor in it. Just tell the man that you're with, who is clearly insecure about this, that the guy that is at that point your friend and,
Closer
a close
to your age,
relationship,
and, yeah.
right, that he's
He's about as valiant as they get.
yes, the guy that you actually kissed to make him jealous. Maybe return to that and go tell him, you do not need to be intimidated by my relationship with Luke.
Yeah.
I think that's just being fair.
She told him that she loved him for a second time when she rescued him from Jabba's palace. You can't tell me that while Luke was off on Dagobah, they didn't have time to have a conversation, about their relationship and where it was going, and what was no longer a factor in it.
See, and that's the what's so silly about it then is that when she does actually say that, is like, isn't that in the middle of the Ewok battle?
It's not in the middle of the Ewok battle. It's just after the Death Star explodes.
Okay.
And Leia's looking up at it, and Han looks up, and he, I guess knows the situation, and he says, I'm sure Luke wasn't on that when it blew. He's trying to be optimistic here, like, oh, geez, I hope Luke's not dead. And she says, he wasn't. I can feel it, referencing her abilities with the Force. But he has that whole, you love him, don't you? She says, well, yes. That would have been a great time to say, well, yes, but not like that. And here's why.
Yeah.
Instead, she just leaves it there long enough for Han to say, all right, fine, I understand. When he gets back, I won't get in the way. Okay? It's like, look, I get it. You and Luke want to have your relationship. In some ways, that makes more sense. He's closer to your age. He's, again, valiant as all get out. It's like, Han's pretty courageous, but Luke has beaten him several times over by this point. And I could understand how, Han would be like, okay, I'll step aside and let you guys have your relationship. Because if it weren't for the fact that, they were brother and sister, I don't know. I think Luke and Leia would have gotten together and been a much better choice for that than Han and Leia. Again, them being related, obviously that's out the window.
Yeah,
but nonetheless,
issue.
I like to think that after that they had a healthy adult brother-sister relationship.
Sure.
At least for a while before he disappeared.
Yeah.
And he was still off doing his Jedi thing and all that. But him being ready to stand aside, Han being ready to stand aside, shows that while he's still hurt, there are things at that point in the story, at least, that are bigger than his ego to him.
And I think that's a huge growth moment for him, and it's good that we see it.
Yeah.
But as far as relationship advice goes, for her in that moment to well, yes, like her coy thing is like, this dude is clearly hung up on this. It is the one insecurity he has in your relationship. Why are you toying with him over it?
Yeah. Because before he was insecure because she wasn't actually speaking her true feelings, even though she was showing so many signs that she was interested. Now he's insecure because there is still the question of what's her relationship with Luke, the guy she made out with to make him jealous, as you said. We are not letting this one go, by the way. We are not letting this issue go. We will drive it into the ground.
I am happy to say that I don't think I personally know of anybody in a relationship like this.
Yeah.
However, I do know that relationships exist where people tend to use the other person's insecurities as a way to keep them around.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that's what Leia is doing, but it's worth touching upon here that I don't think this is something that is fair to be judged from the position of someone who feels like my partner is making me insecure. I'm not going to give that person advice right now. I think that's much deeper. Like that's a whole different thing.
There may be any number of factors that come into play there.
It might not even be true.
That's true, yeah.
Right? Like there are a couple things in that I won't deal with. That said, that if you find yourself in a situation where you think you're playing, you think you're being coy, even if you're mimicking a lot of what we see in TV and media and movies and everything.
Yeah, be careful about that.
If you think you're being flirty, if you think you're challenging somebody in a way that might be helpful.
Yeah.
If in all of these things what you're actually doing is undermining somebody for the sake of, come on, like there are so many things in that I think that like people do think that like, oh, I was just kidding, I was just joking. And that's this playfulness that people get to, like, where you tend to justify the actions that you're taking because you're having fun.
Yeah. And, you get all offended. Oh, that person couldn't take a joke. I was like, well, maybe they don't like that kind of joke. Now, if it's the first time you've ever made a joke like that and they completely flew off the handle, then maybe there's a little bit of a 50-50 thing going on. Or if it's the 100th time that you've told that exact kind of joke, and every other time they gave every indication that it was fine, and that particular time they flew off the handle, okay, that makes some sense why you would be kind of upset about that, because that gets into mixed signals, or, I'm sorry I didn't know, sorts of things like that. But honestly, if you're just constantly telling jokes at their expense and just sort of expecting them to be fine with it without actually trying to read how they feel about it, that is a problem. And if you're going to tell jokes at the other person's expense, you should also tell jokes that lift them up, I think.
Well, I know. I'm not sure you should ever tell jokes at someone else's expense, but it's something where you do need to know. You need to know the person, and you need to watch their reactions to it. When Leia is messing with him, he doesn't fly off the handle. He actually has a rather growth moment that we see, this surprising growth moment that he's like, okay, willing to let her go. But I would argue that she didn't necessarily know he was going to react that way. Granted, there's so much in this that is off camera. And I'm sorry, but George Lucas has never exactly been well known for his writing. And it's something where
story writing, yes. Dialogue writing, no.
Yeah. And so for the idea of what we do see and what it communicates, of course, this is the disclaimer we have to put on every episode that we ever do. We understand these are fictional characters. We understand they're not actually thinking through all of these things. But there is a writer and there's a reality that both exist behind the words. And I think that these characters certainly live a life enough in all of our own brains that once we watch these things, we're able to look at what's going on and pull all of these things from them. So it's like, if you see Leia joking around with Han and giving that that sort of jab in the shoulder, get it, if she has a partner that's willing to be okay with that, maybe it's okay. But I would argue that if that's the level of comfort that you have with your partner, one, if you're not ever going to turn it off, that's a major problem. And two, I would highly recommend you just don't go there, because it is something where it's born from a place that is not defaulting to love and care and fidelity.
Yeah.
I think it comes from a weird place that it's basically just pranking your partner, and that can come. I have a theory about pranking, particularly because I am an Office fan.
Yeah.
That the reason in episodes when you see Jim and we root for him in some of his pranking, and then there's Dwight and you see him go too far when he's why in episodes do we like it when Jim pranks Dwight but not when Dwight pranks Jim? And I did start thinking the reason, my theory, is that pranking is something that is done it's the jester exposing the king. You're taking the undermining position of someone in authority,
or perceived authority.
Right, or perceived authority.
To the regional manager.
And taking them down a peg.
Yeah.
And it is a wise, just, good king that can be jabbed at a little bit. And it is a smart jester that knows how to keep it above the belt.
Yeah.
And
that's big. Keep it above the belt. If you're going to joke with somebody, or even if you are going to fight, which,
yes, keep it above the
belt.
belt.
Very much above the belt. Fight fair.
Right, absolutely.
Don't make this a knockdown, drag out, try to destroy each other thing.
Oh my gosh, you're both trying to come out alive on the other side, living with each other, for crying out loud. So
bear in mind, this person is still, in some cases, depending on your relationship, going to be in your house or in the place where you work.
Right, close
or in your
proximity.
School. Yeah. You have to deal with them again after this.
Yes, and I think that there's a problem when somebody uses pranking in a bullying sense, which is a person in a higher position punching down, so to speak, on somebody who is in a lower position. That whatever that may be, that whether perceived or real, that when it's that kicking somebody while they're down. You both could be in a fist fight, all out brawl, and it's fair. But when one person falls and you keep fighting, you're the jerk.
Yeah.
That's the kind of thing where
no matter who started it.
Yeah. Yes, and especially with your partner, especially with someone that you love and care about. You need to know where the line is. You need to know where pranking is something that they can go, ah, ha, ha, and laugh with you, versus, and your undermining should never actually be something where they feel depleted. If they're doing something where they're beyond a level that they would normally be, and you're going, honey, come back down, maybe that could be appropriate. If you have to make a joke to get somebody to come down off of a ledge a little bit, that's something where, again, you just need to know the person. But in Han and Leia's case, it seems so much a default. And that's the kind of thing we're warning against. Do not let it become a default.
Yeah. And I know that the sequels, again, were not terribly well received by a lot of people and a lot of fans, but honestly, their interaction in The Force Awakens, I think, is exactly what you would expect from the two of them. When she says, no matter how much we fought, I always hated watching you leave. And he says, that's why I did it, so that you'd miss me. It's very revealing about two things. One, that they were fighting constantly, that didn't stop in Empire or even Return of the Jedi, that was just an ongoing thing with these two, and that he would leave during their fights, wouldn't resolve it, would storm out or something like that, so that she'd miss him, and then he could come back, sort of taking advantage of the reunion feelings. Now, in a way, it is kind of sweet the way it's presented at that moment, because it is this very old couple that is coming back to this and coming back together to talk about their history. There is something weirdly endearing about someone who has just been a part of your life for that long, once you reach that age. And it's something sweet about seeing them in a positive light, despite the fact that it hasn't worked out between the two of you. But at the same time, it's not a healthy relationship, and that, just shows the natural progression of it. A lot of people have said things like they didn't like the sequels because they showed us our heroes from the previous movies as broken shells who didn't really get their happily ever afters after all. And I guess I kind of get that we would have liked more to see things like Luke happily married or something like that, or Luke happily teaching students. But with Han and Leia, I really think that's just, we had to face reality about these two. They weren't going to make it.
It's definitely what I feel too. That was the most inevitable trajectory for what they had set up in all of these movies. And something where what you were saying, it made me think of, actually, we talked about Frasier and this idea of two people older reuniting and still feeling some of that attraction for each other. We see that in the reboot with Frasier and Lilith.
Yeah, with Frasier and Lilith.
And they have this moment.
It's kind of cute.
It's utterly toxic.
Yeah.
And yet it's kind of cute because
Yeah.
because there's this nostalgic feel to it of these people who somehow keep finding each other. They continue to be on again, but
Yeah.
we all know, they know that off is better.
Yeah.
Off is what they need, and the reason that those two are connected is because of Freddie. And that is perhaps a statement worth making. Be conscious of the fact that if there is a possibility to produce a child from this relationship,
Yeah.
you do need to take into account that there is a very real possibility that you will be spending the rest of your life with this person, whether you marry them or not.
Yes, because in Frasier and Lilith's case, even though they were not together in the show Frasier and they're not together in the reboot, they see each other on a regular basis in large part because of this child they have in common.
It's where Ted Lasso has that really beautiful moment of Ted talking with his ex-wife and saying, look, we got to raise this little boy together.
Yeah.
And that sort of thing where co-parenting has enough challenges without people hating each other.
Yes, absolutely.
And so that is something where, again, Han and Leia, this is the only reason they are coming back together. I shouldn't say only. There are some wider outside circumstances happening.
Yeah.
But
war, though, ultimately is bringing them back together, just like it brought them together the first time.
right, and so there are wider factors, but ultimately the reason that they have the history that they have is because of the son that they share.
Yeah.
And that, again, goes back to the trauma that they've experienced together. That goes back to the connection that they've had, the good, the bad that they've been through, and they are being very open, very honest, and very vulnerable with each other, ironically, kind of when it ceases to matter as much.
Yeah.
But that is something where, again, he was voluntarily antagonistic to her.
Yeah.
I have trouble even calling that ego. And not just because I don't think it's necessarily even technically true, but at the same time, what it is that drives people in a relationship to be antagonistic with one another. Say if it's not playful, because we've already talked about that. But if it is something where a lot of people pull and, prod one another's insecurities out of a place of their own insecurity. Why on earth would he leave an argument? This is something that I think we see a lot in shows and movies because it's a good place to cut the scene.
Yeah.
And yet, when you're actually in a situation of high tension, don't leave. Find a way to cool the situation. But walking away, slamming the door, and leaving the conversation unfinished is not a good idea.
Yeah, don't get in the Falcon and fly away.
Yeah, that's right. And certainly don't do it just to spite the other person.
Or just because then they'll miss me and they'll want me back. That's, we've dropped a few slightly crass references here, not going to get crazy, but when people talk about makeup sex.
Wow.
That's ultimately the kind of thing that Han is looking for, even if it's not specifically sex, because maybe sex doesn't exist in a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, although there are some clues that it might. But the point is he's banking on the getting back together emotions every time that he leaves so that she misses him.
See, that is something where It's so interesting that this became a also talking about Kelsey Grammer podcast, but I recently finished. I say I recently finished because I started it a very long time ago, but I recently completed Kelsey Grammer's autobiography called So Far, and I would love to hear the continuing story because it was so good. And if you're mildly interested in his work, I recommend it because it was very well written, and he has such a way with words. It was very poetic and it was very nice, and I enjoyed it a lot. It's funny. And yet he is raw. He is so vulnerable, and my goodness, there were several stories that he told that are thick. Man has had a rough life. And in many ways, one of the patterns that he continues to discuss are those of his relationships, eventually discussing his own struggles with what he explains has been a resentful term to him, battered wife syndrome. That he would rather it be called battered spouse syndrome or battered, partner syndrome. Yeah, whatever, something. Yeah, because all it amounts to is what happens to the recipient of abuse in a spousal or committed relationship that breeds that toxicity. And something that he does talk about is that level of kind of like the makeup sex problem, that this what you're basically living for is that endorphin moment, and what you're banking on is but it always gets better. We have these moments, and the reuniting moments that you have are so passionate, or put it all aside. We're not going to talk about that. Let's just have a good, those kinds of things that abusive people tend to say when it comes to something like, we don't need to bring up the past.
Yeah.
Right? Those are those things that come through, that they too tend to have these moments where it's
just forget about the way that I treated you. We're not going to talk about it.
Yes, and let's,
in the name of quote unquote forgiveness.
Let's just move forward. Let's just those kinds of things where there is no resolution and you're not going to be bothered with something that should bother you. And that there are situations where if that person says okay, and then you have this honeymoon phase of moving through a situation where it's worth the bad is worth it for the good, and you start to believe that, and then and oftentimes there are people who their self-esteem becomes so low that they are willing to stay with a person because they feel like maybe that's all that they could get. May I read a little bit from the excerpt of what he actually writes, because he said he could say it so much better than I ever could.
So from Kelsey Grammer's autobiography, So Far.
Yes, so this is literally from his chapter called Marriage from Hell. And I'll go ahead.
Such a great choice of words. Just so eloquent.
Yes. His eloquence comes elsewhere, but
Okay.
But that's appropriately brutal, and I think exactly what he was going for. So this is what he has to say. It's called the battered wife syndrome, but the name is misleading, and because of my experience, I find it personally insulting. Battered spouse would be more accurate and much more acceptable to me. It is a syndrome because in every case there are so many similarities. The most common of these is the victim's inability to leave. Most victims share low self-esteem and fear of abandonment. The impact of abuse, the fact that it has even occurred, is so traumatic and hard to apprehend that it renders them incapable of ever leaving, or even thinking of it as an option. This is the most common reaction, but also the hardest to understand and the most difficult to overcome. Rather, as a rule, battered spouses, because they themselves believe deep down that they deserve it, try to fix things, promise they'll be better, do anything to make the abuser happy. Within the syndrome, there is also a common cycle. It has 3 parts. First, the honeymoon, a short-term period of bliss immediately following an episode. Next, a time of calm, a temporary lull, until finally the abuse explodes again. Self-loathing is the cause of the abuse and also the acceptance of it. The cycle cannot be stopped until the victim leaves or dies, or the perpetrator goes to jail. I now know why I married Leanne right after the first beating, just as soon as my black eye was gone, and why I stayed with her. I believed that she was right about me, that I was all the things she said. So I could not defend myself. 2 things gave me the courage to leave her after only 9 months. One was therapy. The other was my certain knowledge that if things continued, it would ruin my career. Although I couldn't fight for myself, Christopher Plummer had taught me how to fight for my career, and I would allow no one to take it from me. Now, there is an interesting thing in that, of course, he was able to find a way to understand through therapy, as he mentioned, different levels of self-worth, and he does explain a lot of his therapeutic journey in the book, and I think it was probably a big part of him writing it.
Yeah.
But, I didn't expect that we were going to go into this necessarily in this discussion.
In the Han and Leia discussion.
But what I think this is the kind of thing that is worth highlighting with this podcast is to say that, look, there are some of these behaviors that we look at and say, oh, how romantic. Yeah. And then people get trapped in these relationships and go, whoa, that is not healthy.
No.
And it's not. And so to be given this insight, even in the later movies where we have this situation of them saying, like, well, I left and did this, and they have a literal on-again, off-again relationship because they are manipulating one another.
Yeah.
That's not good. And it needs to be called out as such.
On again, off again for something like 30, 40 years. Yeah.
Ugh, it's so rough. And also to believe that it's not just, I don't know, we see constant toxicity between the two of them. They're not good to one another. I don't think they're good for one another. I don't even think I'm not going to say they're not good people. That's kind of the weird part about it, is that they don't seem to carry these behaviors consistently, or I don't think we'd like these characters. And yet, a lot of abusers are quite two-faced. And sometimes just pick one person that they can feel superior around.
Yeah. And even beyond that, a lot of times couples bring out the worst in each other. And I think that while Crisis brought out the best in both of them, they as individuals brought out the worst in each other when all is said and done.
Yeah.
So, yeah, they were doomed from the start, really. And their relationship also doomed the galaxy, just like Padme's and Anakin's did in the prequel trilogy. That's kind of the cycle with Star Wars. There aren't really any healthy long-term relationships in the primary movies anyway. I'm sure that there are some in Clone Wars or something like that.
Yeah, right. Maybe one can be found,
but they're really not healthy in the movies. Rey and Kylo Ren certainly aren't a healthy, happy couple.
No. Yeah. And it is. I think so it's probably worth addressing, why have we rooted for them? Is it really just because the soundtrack made us have all the feels in these moments? Is it just because the movie said we had to?
I think it's because we're rooting for them individually.
Okay.
because we want Han to succeed in his endeavors, because his endeavors are generally so heroic. And we want Leia to succeed in her endeavors because, again, they're generally so heroic. And then, and to a certain degree, I mean, the same kind of relationship that they have with us, the same kind of relationship they have with each other is the relationship that they have with us. Because when we see things like Han saying, "I'm sorry," and with him being ready to stand aside to let Luke in, and when we see her telling him that she loves him despite her hesitance to speak those kinds of words, we see hope that it could work out in the same way that they probably saw hope that it could work out. But ultimately, we kind of know better.
Oh, see, that's a very interesting point because I think you're right. And look, that is often, I think, what is a driving force in many relationships, and where we'd probably all just need to be realistic and self-aware enough to know where the line is between a toxic, possibly abusive relationship or those that you do have that hope for. The kinds of things that to know where the line of, like we said before, fighting above the belt.
Yeah.
That you're not kicking someone when they're down. That if say sparring is a very interesting thing, and then we can go into this, and I'm sure we will many times in other podcasts. But one of the things that we kind of talked about was this playful sparring that we tend to see in a lot of romantic characters. And that is sort of a playful, flirtatious kind of pushing each other's boundaries in an appropriate way in order to find out what they are.
Yeah.
That's okay. And I think that's
essentially like rough play when you're kids.
Yeah.
Kids engage in rough play in part to find out where the limit is between we're playing and we're hurting. And when kids are just sort of having fun, roughhousing, whatever, that's one thing. But when a kid starts expressing that they are in pain, the other kid needs to stop. And they need to learn that that's the moment when you stop. I've seen that happen with dogs, too. They'll be playing and it look pretty rough, and they got their teeth on each other. But the second one of them yelps or something like that, boom, it's over.
And I
the
think
whole game stops.
I think we can all admit that there is a lot of resiliency in some of these childlike relationships. When you have situations where, say, like, I know that when I was a kid, I had those silly relationships where it's like, we're not going to be friends anymore, and then you're friends the next day. But then there were also situations I can think back on where we legitimately said horrible things to each other. Or, that really it was like, whoa, that's not cool. But then you'd kind of move past it and kind of without appropriate resolve.
Yeah.
And that's a weird dynamic, I think, of learning social behavior, and could probably go off on that for a while, but I won't. But there is something that in that I think demands maturity from relationships, because that resilience is appropriate at times in order to develop within yourself to know where the boundary line is. This is, let me get scientific on it for a second. That's literally how your brain works. When you have gray matter, that is a malleable, changeable state for the physical part of your brain to be able to continually remap itself. When you start to produce white matter, that is the solidification of processes in your brain. And you need both in certain things. But whereas we get older, we are less inclined to do what children do in the sake of social interaction, in creativity, in communal situations, and that community that the prefrontal cortex kind of fights against as we get older, we are less willing to be malleable in that way and to make those decisions with the people. Like we say, I'm not going to do this anymore, I've been hurt before. That is actually, that can be a good thing, it can be a bad thing. And where we need to be willing to apply both a resiliency that we can see in children, that you don't allow petty things to keep you from a good relationship, but also where you get to a point where you need to understand that there's a difference between learning something appropriately and trauma responses. And so if you're actually engaging with another person and trying to work through a relationship, you need to be willing to balance the difference between how hard am I working for this relationship? How hard are they working for me? Is this too hard? Is this not a good hard? Right? It's kind of like an exercise. You can tell the difference between pain and the burn.
Yeah.
Right? Like, no, this is a wrong kind of pain. You don't keep going at that point. So if you push yourself in exercise because you feel the burn, that might be a good thing. But if you push yourself to the point where you're going to break something,
that's sprain or
right,
hurt something.
You're going to get hurt. That is something where I think that metaphor can run through relationships all day long, because you do need to have an awareness of your own body, your own emotions, and your own self in order to be able to be both protective and vulnerable.
Yes.
And
that's huge.
Yeah. I don't think that Han and Leia are a good example of that, but I do think that it's probably worth going through, one, the toxicity that they represent, but also being able to say that we get it. There are some things that you want to see it work. You want to cheer this on and you want to work hard to make it work. But know where the line is.
Yeah, certainly. And what kind of work is appropriate? Because I think while we did agree that they were pretty well doomed from the start, there's also something to be said for if they had been taught the right kind of work they needed to do in order to make their relationship function. Maybe he wouldn't have been running away after every fight so that she would miss him. Maybe they would have actually worked it out. Maybe they wouldn't have been punching below the belt. Maybe she wouldn't have called him scruffy looking.
Right. What we see throughout the 3 original movies should not have continued on for us to see if they had tools, had opportunity to work through some of those things. We wouldn't have seen them in the sequel still broken up, But like we said, they gave us no indication in those movies that they would eventually be healthy.
Yeah.
And let's not kid ourselves to think that they were. We often, and I think we're going to run into a lot of things in these discussions to say that we're going to find a lot of people that we cheer for who are not healthy. Ross and Rachel. But there is something to be learned in those relationships of why do we like it and why shouldn't we? So it's something where I am all for the benefit of these conversations being something where we can be like, we can have an audience on the other side that listens and is discerning relationships to the point of, I wouldn't do it that way, I would do it this way. I think that's the best thing that we can pull from any of these as far as the point of watching media And picking apart relationships is not to emulate them, but to understand and to maybe try and pull in some of this psychology and the things behind it to say, why would they have done that? And what do you do? What you and I do all the time,
Yeah.
which is to pick apart these relationships and say, why would they have done that? Act as if they were real and judge their actions a little bit.
Yeah. Because let's be honest, a lot of these couples that we're talking about are from comedies.
Right.
And oftentimes the funniest comedy comes from people doing the thing they shouldn't have done.
Yes.
And therefore we should not be looking at them as examples, but as anti-examples. And Star Wars, in many ways, is very tragic. I'm not going to say that it's a tragedy because, the good guys still win at the end. But it is very tragic, and a lot of tragic things happen. And the thing about tragedy is that it's the same way. The characters aren't doing the things they should be doing. They're not making the right choices. They're making the faulty choices that are going to cost them. Luke all day makes all kinds of choices that he shouldn't have made, and he pays a pretty heavy price for them. Still does the right thing in the end, but by gosh, he makes a lot of wrong choices. Right down to never should have thrown that lightsaber away. I get that he didn't know that the Emperor had lightning fingers, but
but
still,
seriously.
it's like, don't throw that away. You hold on to that in case the Emperor has some other tricks up his sleeve, even if he just has a blaster.
Yeah. I think if you go into some of these things knowing that they are a tragedy, you're less likely to see the protagonist as the hero when the actions that they're taking are not heroic. Just because they're the person that is like the main center of the story doesn't mean that they're good. And we do need to be willing to be discerning about these characters in a way that like, look, I know some people don't like when people get into characters as deeply as we are. You wouldn't be listening if you were one of those people. But
True.
At the same time, I think that the benefit in picking apart some of this is because we do need to be willing to discern that human behavior that goes into a lot of writing and representation, that even for actors say, there are situations like you were saying with a comedy. I'm an obsessive listener to the Office Ladies podcast, and they were very recently talking about how James Spader was given a note at one point, and the director was basically saying, like, because it's funnier. That's why you should do it this way. And yet Jenna, the classically trained actor, was like, yeah, but I hear every actor in that where he just didn't even know, like, but why am I doing this? Because you need to know your motivation. You need to know what's behind it. You need to, like, am I a person that gets confused easily? They say, why would I take this note of play it confused if I don't know why, if I'm confused about why my character would be confused? If you can't inform your character in that way, it's harder to portray it. So if the actors are willing to go there, which comedic actors, those like Angela Kinsey, who are in an improv background where they're just going to go for the line. They're just going to go for the joke. They're just going to do what's funniest. It's not really about reading into the background and the impetus of this behavior. So that's something where you and I are reading into these characters with a way that is probably more that lens of the classical actor that wants to assume that there was something behind it that informed these decisions.
Yeah.
And so when we're talking about and giving advice and all of these things, I think it's so interesting to me to be able to pull out what we did even just from Han and Leia just now, because we didn't expect to go there.
I think that if you were to watch every Han and Leia scene that isn't just them fighting stormtroopers or shooting down TIE fighters, it probably adds up to a total of 15 minutes. And we have spent an hour and a half talking about it.
Yes, exactly. Well, you and I get to spend a lot of time talking about a lot of things.
True.
But it is something where there is depth there. There is.
Yes.
And so when we're looking into these characters, and as we continue to do so, I think what the most gratifying part of it is to be able to look at these characters and maybe grow in our own relationships because of I wouldn't have done it the way they did. I see myself moving down that pathway, and I'm not going to do it that way.
Yeah.
So if they're like, we all have those characters in our lives that they've shaped us, whether it's a figure from a book or a movie or a TV show. There's a quote, or it might even be a real person that said something that just, their thoughts become our thoughts, and it kind of lives in us because we identify with them deeply. And so when we have that, I think it's a really cool, powerful thing of storytelling. So all the more that we should have not only our heroes, but those people who, like the others in our lives, who we see what happens to them and say, I don't want that to happen to me. I think we need to look at our literary and media figures to say, I'm going to learn a lesson from that.
Yeah. And there are a lot of great lessons to learn here. That's why we do this show. And it's fun.
And we would be having these conversations even if they weren't recorded.
True.
Because they're fun.
Yes. Well, thank you very much for tuning in, everybody. Come check us out next time.
That was On Again, Off Again. And we're off again.